So the next in series is called the interaction model of communication. Communication is a two-way process in which people switch between the roles of a sender and receiver and produce meaning by providing and receiving feedback in both relation to internal as well as external circumstances. This is how meaning is produced. So according to interaction model, this model does a good job in capturing the interactive aspects of communication. Nevertheless, it does not take into account the ways in which communication molds our experiences and influencing our social cultural setting in which it occurs. As the name suggests, the interactive model of communication refers to the process of communication that takes place between a back and forth manner. It's a characteristic of everyday conversation. So, for example, a message is delivered to a receiver from a sender and the receiver then responds to the message. According to interactional model of communication, communication is a process which players switch off roles in between the sender and the receiver. That means, depending on the meaning which is produced through the communication and receiving the feedback in social and physical environments, the role of a sender and the receiver exchanges. This occurs in the context of interaction model of communication, which is suggested by Stram in 1997. So the interaction model incorporates feedback which recasts communication not as a linear one-way process, but as more interactive two-way process. So this is the first time through this model we have started accepting communication is a two-way process. And after that, the advanced models have started putting it in a cyclical process. This is in contrast to the representation of communication as a process that occurs only in one direction. So the term feedback here refers to communications that are set in response to those of other users. For example, your instructor may react to a question that you ask while the class is in session, or you may point to the sofa when your roommate inquires about the location of the remote control. In both the cases, incorporating a feedback loop into a communication engagement also leads to a more sophisticated view of the roles that individuals play in the exchange of information. So in place of a single sender, a single message and a single receiver, this model makes use of two senders, two receivers who also communicate via message and message exchanges. Every participant takes turn being the sender and receiver of the information so that the communication encounter can continue uninterrupted. Despite the fact that this appears not to be a noticeable and intentional activity, we routinely do this and we very fast exchange positions as transmitter and receiver without giving it much attention. This is done without even realizing that we are doing so in a very quick, maybe some kind of reflexive actions. In a similar fashion, the interactional model also places a greater focus on interactions than it does on the messages. This is a very important factor to ponder over here. The transmission model focused on how a message was transmitted, whether or not it was received. Whereas the interaction model is more concerned with the communication process itself and how it occurs. This is a paradigm shift which takes into account the reality that a large number of messages are being transmitted all at once, and it is also possible that some of these messages will not even be received. In addition, there are times when communications are sent out as an error. So as a consequence of this, the efficacy of communication in the context of this paradigm is not determined by the question of whether or not a single message was successfully transmitted and received. So the interaction model takes into account both the physical and psychological aspects of the environment. The physical context of a communication encounter takes into account the environmental characteristics of the connection. The dimensions of a space are as well as the design, climate, lighting, all have the impact on your capacity to communicate. Just think about the different kinds of locations that the job interviews take place and how those in different environments might affect how you communicate with the interviewer. So this is precisely what is the understanding of the word of interactive model.